Hello and welcome back to another update as we cover the latest developments from the front line, and the focus of this one will yet again be around Avdiivka as Russian forces continue their offensive in the direction of the city, where they have four main areas of attack where the main fighting is focused around, so we will be going over them one by one. Starting out, before going to the fighting by Avdiivka, there's been some armored assaults by the Russian forces in the direction of the area between Persky, Pervomaisk and Novelsk. The Russian forces are generally starting to use their armored forces in between the direction of Donetsk and all the way up to the northern direction of Kupiansk. We've seen many videos of the Russian convoys moving to the front, battles between the Russian forces and the Ukrainian forces, and some Russian armored losses. This is at a scale we haven't seen since the start of the war. The Russian forces have not used the armored vehicles to this point since the initial offensives and invasions leading to Kiev, Mykolaiv and so on. So the fighting right now we are seeing is the Russian forces are mostly focused around Avdiivka, where we are here seeing the fighting by Severne. The Russian forces started an attack from Vodiane towards Severne, where they're moving through the front, trying to lead towards the village as they try to capture it. So the way they are launching the attack is that they moved from their positions in Vodiane through the roads up to the forest lines, and then they moved through the forest lines and the fields in columns. They moved one by one through the open fields, as the Ukrainian forces hardly have any mines in comparison to the Russian forces, where in the south they had loads of mines preventing the Ukrainian offensive. Here we are hardly seeing any Ukrainian ones. So most of the Russian vehicles are either facing off against Ukrainian ones or getting hit by Ukrainian artillery, ATGMs and so on. From most of the videos we have seen so far, there's been mostly Ukrainian artillery against Russian tanks, and this is why we're seeing the Russian tanks advance so far, because there's no minefield slowing them down and there's no front confrontation between the two sides until they reach the villages where the Ukrainian positions are located. As for the south of Avdiivka, here we're seeing very slow advances, but this is because of the heavy fortifications of the Ukrainian forces in this area. As I mentioned in my previous video, the Avdiivka city is the heaviest fortification in the whole country of Ukraine. There's no area in Ukraine more fortified than Avdiivka, and we see this by zooming in all the way down south in the Russian areas. We see that there's heavy trenches everywhere. There's this military base here to the southwest of Avdiivka. There's more trenches and roads here to the south. And at the front line, the area the Russians just captured here, as reported by Remy Lind, who yet again has soldiers on the front. He's saying that based on the information he's receiving from the soldier fighting here in Avdiivka, the fighting is very heavy, and this could turn into a new Bakhmut due to the heavy fortifications. Despite the Russians putting in much more effort, much more manpower and much more equipment at their disposal to fight here in Avdiivka, it is just that much harder and more difficult for the Russians to capture the areas. So we see here there's a large trench network that goes here to the north, connected here to the south as well, here by the bridge that is blown up already back when the satellite image was taken, and then connected further south. So there's a lot of connections here between the trenches, and this is an old satellite image. So most likely at this point there's much more trenches than what we see here. We also see here to the east there's trenches that go here from the forest patches here down south towards the road, and we see that the fortifications also go here down south towards the roads and so on. So there's a lot of fortifications, and yet there's even more even after that. So there's just trenches after trenches after trenches, and now there's also concrete fortifications. There's heavy Ukrainian artillery in this area as well. So the Russian forces are suffering a lot of losses, as is seen in these videos. The Russians have hardly released any videos about the fighting. They've just released videos and photos from far away from the city of Donetsk, all the way back, where they are essentially filming from the high-rise buildings in Donetsk to reach the area of Krasnoyarivka and seeing the whole area, the smoke screens that are rising from the city, from the heavy bombardments from Russian Air Force, and the general use of multi-launch rocket systems, artillery and so on. So there's heavy bombardment all throughout Avdiivka, mostly focused around the fortified citadel area here to the west of Avdiivka, with high-rise buildings and heavy fortifications, but also at the front lines where the fighting is taking place. So as seen here, there's heavy trench networks and fortifications all throughout the forest areas here to the south of the city. So this is very tough fighting, and questioning why the Russians are just moving through these fortifications instead of focusing on their attacks to the sides, I will never have the answer to. This is similar to Bakhmut, where they just walk right through. But according to the reports, we hear that the Russian forces and the Wagner forces, who have started signing contracts with the Russian Ministry of Defense, have combined their forces in this area and are fighting side by side. Most likely the Wagner forces are incorporated into these Russian units, and then they are sharing their experience with Bakhmut and telling them what kind of tactics they were using, how they were advancing, and so on. According to unofficial information, there's 5,000 Wagner soldiers fighting side by side Russian soldiers in this direction, and we have multiple brigades of Russian and DPR soldiers fighting here. So there's generally somewhere around 20 to 25,000 Russian mechanized soldiers in this direction fighting on the Russian side. That is what we have seen officially. There's also unofficially the ones that haven't appeared on camera and so on fighting here. And then there's also the Russian Air Force and the amount of artillery they have available. The Ukrainian forces are similar to that, or even fewer. So the Ukrainians have fewer soldiers than the Russians in this part. However, since they are on the defensive, it makes up for their lack of manpower and firepower. As for the northern front, we have the last two axes of attack. We have the southern one, which is here by the coke plant, which the Russian forces managed to capture. This is the highest point in this whole area, this whole part of the front line. The coke plant is the highest point, which has about 20 meters advantage over any other points here in this whole area. There are some heights here to the east of Avdiivka, which has a similar height, but a bit lower, but it's a far distance from it. So we're seeing with this capture of the coke plant by the Russian forces, they now overlook the whole area and are able to attack at any point from this position. So this is a very advantageous position for the Russians to capture, and with this they have two options. They can either advance southwest into the city of Avdiivka, or they can move westwards. Either case, they have full control over the railway now with this position here overlooking the railway. They are also fighting straight ahead from Krasnohorivka towards the railway, where they're trying to cross over and attack Stepove and Berdishi from the high grounds to the north of these villages. Both of these villages are located in valleys, so the high grounds north of it will overlook these villages. So the Russian forces is currently planning on taking the high grounds and then advancing from these positions to different areas to flank the Ukrainian positions, possibly pincer them from the south and from the north, and at the same time trying to capture the heights everywhere else. So all of these operations are clearly to try and storm the Ukrainian positions and close off all of the supply routes to then reach a point where they have control over all roads in and out of Avdiivka. So this is essentially a repeat of Bakhmut. They're trying to recreate a meat grinder, or just generally do the semi-encirclement where there's only one road in and out where they constantly bombard it to then starve out the Ukrainian forces within Avdiivka. Moving on to the combat footage of the area, we see multiple pictures. First off, the first one is here to the south of Krasnohorivka, east of this river here. And then we see the second one right north of the coke plant. These are all photos of Russian armored vehicles moving through the south of Krasnohorivka and down south to the coke plant, fighting over it. So we see that the Ukrainians had them on their scopes and constantly launching artillery strikes onto Russian forces from the point they leave Krasnohorivka to the point they reach the coke plant and fight over it. Then we see this video here of a Russian tank that drives through one of these fields, likely to the west of Krasnohorivka in these lighter fields. So we see that the tank was either hit by a mine or by some artillery targeting it, and there's some infantry walking behind it on its tracks. So essentially they have this tank similar to World War I tactics, where the tank would go on to guard the infantry and the infantry is right behind them. So this is actually showing one of the things that has changed since the start of the war. At the start of the war, the Russians would launch these tanks without any infantry support. now there is infantry support, so they're able to actually hold on to the territories that they capture. So the capture and the advances are slow because they have to keep at the speed of the infantry. But then there's also armored convoys only, which we see in this video right here. So in this video here, we see a long convoy of Russian tanks and other armored vehicles as they advance in the direction of Avdiivka. They're preparing for one of the offensives that the Russian forces are launching in this direction. And there's constant Ukrainian artillery that isn't very accurate as it hits on the sides of the target, but they are shooting at them nonetheless, which means that they've detected them and they are aiming to destroy them. Then we see this final video here, which shows essentially a montage of a drone flying over a field where there's been a lot of fighting. Due to the amount of shelling next to the tanks, it's most likely from the southern parts, and the color of the ground, it matches the description of the southern front. We see all of these holes from artillery throughout the years. So most likely it's from this part, but I haven't geolocated it. But essentially we see about 10 tanks and other armored vehicles destroyed of the Russian side. I'm not sure when this was taken, but it's likely lately, as it has been shared a lot around, but I haven't been able to confirm. But essentially we are seeing that the Russian forces are not having a straight assault on Avdiivka. They're taking a lot of losses, as is seen in this video, and they are also storming multiple locations on a heavily fortified area, but they are advancing nonetheless. This is something different from what we have seen since January. This is the first time Russian soldiers, not Wagner soldiers, but Russian soldiers are launching a real offensive. This is bigger than Uladar. This is bigger than all the other ones. This is the first one where they're actually launching something that they're advancing in and not taking extremely heavy losses. This is a suitable amount of losses for an offensive this scale. And that is going to be all for this update. Thank you all for watching and have a great day.